Eleanor Hayes stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, staring up at the manor that was now, somehow, hers. The letter from the lawyer had arrived only 2 weeks earlier, sitting unopened on her kitchen table for 3 days, because she assumed it was a mistake. Nobody left libraries and inheritance. Nobody left her anything at all. But the letter was real. Her great-aunt Margaret, a woman she had met only twice as a child, had passed away at the age of 91, and left her entire estate to Eleanor, her only living relative. The estate, it turned out, was Ashcombe Manor, a house Eleanor had never even heard of until the lawyer mentioned its name. Now, standing before it, she understood why nobody had ever spoken of it. The manor was enormous, built from gray stone that had once been elegant, but was now streaked with moss and age. Ivy crawled up one entire side of the building, swallowing windows whole. Several panes of glass were broken, and part of the roof on the eastern wing had caved in, leaving a gap she could see daylight through. The garden, what remained of it, had grown wild. Tall grass, tangled rose bushes, and weeds that had claimed every path. Eleanor pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and walked toward the front door. The key the lawyer had given her felt heavy in her palm, as if it carried the weight of decades nobody had bothered to deal with. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. Sheets covered most of the furniture, ghostly white shapes scattered through rooms that had clearly once been beautiful. A grand staircase curved up from the entrance hall, its banister carved with intricate patterns now dulled by neglect. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects long forgotten, frames crooked from years of nobody straightening them. She should have felt overwhelmed. In many ways, she did. But there was something else too, a quiet pull toward the house, as if it were waiting for someone to notice it again. Eleanor decided to stay, at least for a while. She had little to return to in town. A small flat she rented, a job at the library that paid barely enough to live on, and a routine that had grown stale without her noticing. Ashcombe Manor, ruined as it was, offered something different. A project, a purpose, maybe even a future. The first few days were spent simply assessing the damage. She made lists of what needed fixing, what could be saved, and what was beyond repair. She found old documents in a study at the back of the house, deeds, letters, ledgers, and began piecing together the manor's history. It had been built nearly 200 years earlier, passed down through generations of her mother's side of the family, until it reached her great-aunt, who had lived there alone for the last 30 years of her life, slowly losing the battle against time and disrepair. It was on the 4th day, while Eleanor was clearing fallen branches from the front drive, that a car appeared. It was sleek and dark, clearly expensive, and entirely out of place against the backdrop of the crumbling manor. Eleanor straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands, as the car came to a stop and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a tailored coat that looked like it cost more than her monthly rent. His expression was composed, almost guarded, and there was an air about him that suggested he was used to being taken seriously. "Miss Hayes?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "That's me," Eleanor said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Can I help you?" "My name is Julian Ashford," he said. "I believe we have some matters to discuss regarding the boundary lines of this property." Eleanor blinked. "Boundary lines?" "I am the Duke of Renfield," he said, as though that explained everything. "My family's estate borders this land. There has been a dispute over a section of the property for quite some time, since before either of us were born, in fact. I had hoped to speak with whoever inherited Ashcombe about resolving it." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, processing the fact that a duke, an actual duke, was standing in front of her ruined inheritance, talking about boundary lines as if this were a perfectly normal Tuesday. "I didn't even know I owned this place a week ago," she said finally. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Julian's expression softened, just slightly. "I see. Then perhaps we should start from the beginning." That conversation, awkward and confusing as it was, marked the start of something Eleanor never could have predicted. Over the following weeks, Julian returned several times, bringing old maps and documents that traced the disputed boundary back generations. It turned out that a strip of land between the two estates had never been formally divided, leading to decades of unresolved tension between the two families. Tension that had apparently outlived everyone who originally cared about it. At first, Eleanor was wary. She assumed Julian's visits were purely about securing whatever land he believed belonged to his family, and she braced herself for difficult negotiations. But as the meetings continued, she began to notice something different in him. He wasn't cold, not really. He was careful, methodical, the kind of person who chose his words with precision because he had learned, somewhere along the way, that words mattered. When she asked him about his own estate, his answers revealed exhaustion beneath the polished exterior. Years spent trying to keep his family's properties from falling into the same kind of ruin Ashcombe now faced. "It's harder than people think," he admitted one afternoon, as they sat at the kitchen table going over old documents. "Everyone assumes that having a title means having unlimited resources. In truth, half of what I do is hold things together, with very little money, and even less help." Eleanor laughed, surprising herself. "Welcome to my world. Except I don't even have the title to make people take me seriously." Julian looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You don't need a title for that." It was a small comment, barely more than a passing remark, but it stayed with Eleanor longer than she expected. As autumn deepened into the colder months, their meetings became less about boundary lines and more about the manor itself. Julian, despite his initial reason for visiting, found himself drawn into the project of restoring Ashcombe. He recommended contractors he trusted, ones who wouldn't take advantage of Eleanor's limited budget. He helped her understand which parts of the house were structurally sound and which needed immediate attention. And, more than once, he simply rolled up his sleeves and helped her clear debris himself, much to the visible confusion of the driver who waited outside for him. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor told him one cold afternoon, as they hauled broken furniture out of the east wing. "I know," Julian said simply, setting down a chair leg. "I want to." Eleanor didn't push the matter further, though she found herself thinking about his answer more than she probably should have. Their conversations grew easier with time. Eleanor learned that Julian had inherited his title young, after his father's sudden passing, and had spent the years since trying to prove to everyone, his family, his peers, himself, that he was capable of carrying the weight of it. He rarely spoke about personal matters, but one evening, over tea in the half-furnished parlor, he mentioned an engagement from years earlier that had ended not because of heartbreak, but because of the realization that the relationship had never been about affection at all. It had been about expectation. "She wasn't wrong to leave," Julian said quietly. "Neither of us wanted what the other one needed." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she simply listened, and somehow that felt like enough. In return, she told him about her own life, the predictability of it, the comfort she had built around herself, precisely because she had never expected anything more. Inheriting Ashcombe had cracked that comfort wide open, and though it was terrifying, she found she didn't want to go back to the way things had been before. It was during one of their long afternoons searching through the manor's old archives that they made a discovery neither of them expected. Tucked into a forgotten drawer in the study were letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbon, addressed between Eleanor's great-aunt Margaret and a man named Edmund Ashford. Julian's hands went still as he read the name. "Edmund Ashford," he said slowly. That was my grandfather's brother. Eleanor unfolded one of the letters carefully, the paper soft with age. As they read through them together, a story unfolded that neither family had ever spoken of. A love between Margaret and Edmund that had been quietly forbidden decades earlier, deemed inappropriate by both families due to differences in status and expectation. The letters spoke of stolen afternoons, secret meetings near the very boundary line that Julian and Eleanor had been arguing over, and a heartbreak that had never fully healed for either of them. Margaret had stayed at Ashcombe her whole life, never marrying, and Edmund had eventually left to live abroad, never returning to Renfield. They never got their chance, Eleanor said softly, setting the letter down. Julian was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. They didn't. The discovery changed something between them, though neither said it directly. It was as if the weight of that old, unfinished story had settled over their own, drawing an uncomfortable but undeniable parallel. Not long after, complications arose that threatened to derail everything Eleanor had been working toward. A development company, eager to acquire land in the area, approached her with an offer to buy Ashcombe outright, citing the unresolved boundary dispute as legal grounds to pressure a quick sale. They hinted at expensive litigation, vague threats about complications that could drag on for years if she refused to cooperate. Eleanor, already stretched thin financially, felt the panic settle in her chest. She mentioned it to Julian almost reluctantly, not wanting to seem as though she expected him to fix her problems. But Julian's reaction was immediate. They can't force you to sell, he said firmly. And the boundary dispute has nothing to do with the rest of your property. They're using confusion to scare you. He used his own legal resources, not to control the outcome, but to ensure Eleanor had the information and protection she needed to make her own decision. He sat with her through meetings with solicitors, answered questions when she didn't understand the legal language, and made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that he wasn't going to let her face the pressure alone. In the end, the development company backed down, unable to find any real leverage once the situation was properly examined. Eleanor kept Ashcombe, boundary dispute and all. The matter eventually settled through a simple, fair agreement between her and Julian that resolved decades of unnecessary tension in a single afternoon. But it wasn't the legal resolution that stayed with Eleanor. It was the way Julian had shown up, not as a duke asserting control, but as someone who genuinely wanted to protect her right to choose her own path. Winter passed slowly into spring, and with it, Ashcombe Manor began to transform. The east wing was repaired, the roof no longer letting in rain. The garden, though still wild in places, had been cleared enough to reveal flower beds that hadn't bloomed in years. Eleanor spent her mornings working in the garden, and her afternoons continuing repairs inside, often with Julian beside her, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm that neither had quite expected. It was in that garden, one warm afternoon in early spring, that everything shifted. Eleanor was kneeling in the dirt, planting bulbs she had ordered weeks earlier, when Julian approached carrying something in his hand. It was one of the old letters between Margaret and Edmund, the one where Margaret had written that she would have given up everything, her home, her name, her comfort, for even a single chance at the life she truly wanted. I keep thinking about this, Julian said, sitting down on the stone bench nearby, about how much time they lost because they were too afraid to choose what they actually wanted. Eleanor sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. It's sad, she agreed. All that time, wasted on fear. Julian looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, his composed expression gave way to something more open, more uncertain. I don't want to make the same mistake, he said quietly. Eleanor's heart caught in her chest. Julian. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are, he continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm not asking you to want a title, or an estate, or any of this. I'm asking if you would consider building something with me, not because of who I am, but because of who we've become together, working through all of this." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. She thought of the months they had spent together, the quiet moments of understanding, the way Julian had shown up, not with grand gestures, but with steady, consistent presence. She thought of Margaret and Edmund, separated by fear and expectation, never given the chance to choose each other openly. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I would like that very much." Julian's relief was visible, his shoulders relaxing in a way she had never seen before. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, the two of them sitting together in the garden that had once been forgotten and was now, slowly but surely, coming back to life. The following months brought continued work on Ashcombe, but now there was a different energy to it, not just restoration, but creation. Together, Eleanor and Julian transformed the manor into something neither of their families had managed in generations. A home built on partnership rather than obligation, on choice rather than expectation. They placed Margaret and Edmund's letters in a small display in the study, a quiet tribute to the love that had been denied so long ago. It felt right somehow, that the house which had once held so much unspoken sorrow would now become a place of new beginnings. Eleanor never lost her love for the library, continuing her work there part-time, even as Ashcombe demanded much of her attention. She found that balance suited her, holding on to the life she had built while embracing the unexpected one that had found her. Julian, for his part, continued managing his own estate, but found that working alongside Eleanor gave him a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that responsibility didn't have to mean isolation. By the time autumn returned, a year after Eleanor had first walked up the overgrown drive to Ashcombe Manor, the house looked entirely different. The ivy had been trimmed back, the windows replaced, the garden in full, vibrant bloom. It was still a work in progress, much like the relationship that had grown within its walls, but it was no longer a ruin, it was a home. Standing together on the front steps one quiet evening, watching the sun set over the restored gardens, Eleanor leaned her head against Julian's shoulder. "Do you think they would be happy?" she asked. "Margaret and Edmund?" Julian wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I think," he said softly, "they would be glad someone finally got the ending they didn't." Eleanor smiled, watching the golden light settle over the manor that had once been forgotten and was now, finally, exactly where it belonged.